All right, psychology. So let's keep going with our study of developmental psychology. And in this lecture, we are going to be looking at the idea of attachment and how our relationships with our parents can impact our development into our later years. So let's get going. So we call this attachment theory. And the first idea that we need to look at is something called stranger anxiety. And right around age 7 months to 8 months, infants begin to get anxious and fearful around strangers. And they get very clingy to their parent. And the situation can sometimes seem so emotionally significant to them. And they are beginning to recognize that there is a difference between their mother versus someone who isn't their mother. And they see this as possibly very threatening. And they begin to attach some anxious feelings towards these people that are not their mother. And we can look to science to kind of make that explanation for us and what it is and why that infant-parent bond is so important. And so we look to actually biology, and a researcher, a scientist by the name of Konrad Lorenz, who did some studying on attachment. And his study actually centered around geese. And what he did was he kind of attached himself to these geese when they were just hatched without a mother. And what he found was that in this critical period that these geese had without a mother, just hours after they were hatched, in this critical period, by inputting himself and imposing himself into their world, that these geese were able to form an attachment with him. And he labeled this something called imprinting. And so what imprinting actually is, it's the process by which certain animals form attachments during this critical period, very early in life. And obviously, baby animals are going to imprint best to their own species. You could substitute another seal for a mother seal who's missing. But if necessary, animals have the ability to form an attachment with another mother caregiver substitute. And so the thing that we need to understand, though, is that humans don't imprint. We don't imprint, but it's very much a fact that we do become attached to what we know. Think of the objects, think of the people in a baby's life that allow them to form a very secure, attached relationship. Whether it's a caregiver who is there continuously, whether it's a blanket, whether it's a stuffed animal. And as people, we seem to have a longer period, and some researchers and psychologists have called this our sensitive period, where we form this attachment. So an important study in attachment theory and in development was conducted by a psychologist named Harry Harlow. And his studies showed us the importance of what he called contact comfort. And in his surrogate mother experiment, he demonstrated the importance of contact comfort. And so he took these baby monkeys, and they were separated from their mothers, and they were given two surrogate mothers. One was made out of wire, another was made out of a nice, soft terry cloth material. And what he found was that the baby monkeys, they actually preferred to cling to the terry cloth mother, even though that terry cloth mother didn't have food. And so what it showed Harlow was that contact and touch are ever so important to the development and the emotional well-being of these monkeys, which can also then translate into humans. Because touch, remember how important the sense of touch is. Touch is how babies feel secure, and touch is how babies learn to trust. And so contact and touch are vital to attachment, according to Harry Harlow's research. Another key researcher in developmental psychology and the ideas of attachment theory, another person, her name is Mary Ainsworth, and I like to call her Mother Mary because her research kind of centered around the ideas that children form these attachments primarily to mothers, and this was what her research studied. So it becomes an easy way to remember the type of research that she did. And so she noticed that infants all over the world used these attachment figures, and infants need parents to survive, and they have to make decisions, and in their brains it's a survival decision if the caregiver, if the mother isn't there. And so there's a complex set of interactions that actually happens between infants and mothers. And what she called these sets of interactions, she called them the strange situation experiments. And so how infants behave when their parents are absent and how they react when their parents return gave a lot of information to Ainsworth. And what it came down to is that your parents' behavior is very critical for those individual differences in how you attach. And so the term secure attachment, what Ainsworth observed, and this was true in 70% of the infants that she studied, that when the caregiver left, the baby was upset. They would cry, they wouldn't be comforted by a stranger. And then when the caregiver returned, they made an effort to touch the caregiver and return to the activity that they were already engaged in. But in order for this to happen, the mother had to have characteristics that showed that she was a sensitive, responsive mother, and that mothers cared about the reaction and the terror in some cases that some of these babies showed when the mother left the room. And to take this a step further, Ainsworth also identified characteristics of these children that might indicate an insecure attachment. And very often children, when the mother left, if they didn't seem upset, and if they didn't cry, or if they instantly latched on to another individual, as an infant, as a young child, oftentimes these might be mothers that were maybe less responsive, and they may have been very anxious mothers and actually raised their kids in an environment where they were unsure of their role or competent in their role as a parent. So Ainsworth believed that sensitive, responsive, calm parenting is correlated with the secure attachment style. And that if parents are sensitive, responsive, and calm, it creates a sense of trust for these children, and it can become the foundation for adult relationships. All these crazy little things that happen when you are a child, that it's laying the foundation for those adult relationships. So our early attachment, that foundation for adult relationships, all circle back to that comfort, that intimacy, the affection that we get as children. And securely attached people actually have less of a fear of failure and a greater drive for achievement. So there are all kinds of little tidbits of information in these infant relationships and that relationship that you have with a mother, and it can be fathers as well. Her research, however, only focused on the female caregiver. So now we are going to continue looking at attachment, but we're going to look at attachment differences. And so the question is attachment style the result of genetically influenced temperament? And so the word temperament is similar to like your personality. It's the aspect of your personality that you are born with. It's kind of your mood and the way that you react to certain situations. It's how you learn whether you can self-regulate if things aren't going your way. What can you do to calm yourself down or make your case known? And they say that, the research says, that your attachment style, secure or insecure, could be the result of your temperament. And very often, children that are labeled as easy kids, they tend to have regular routines in their lives. They are, for the most part, very cheerful and very positive in new situations. And that is a result of a secure attachment and a more positive temperament. But what role does the parent actually play in creating these social skills that children develop? So we are going to look at the research of Baumrind and how she identifies the parenting styles that we as parents tend to show from time to time. It's not to say that every parent is 100% one of these styles. It's very possible that there is a blend of different parenting styles. That being said, it's important to understand, though, the differences between each of them. So an authoritarian parenting style is more restrictive. They're more restrictive. And the children in an authoritarian home tend to have less social skills. They might be living under an element of fear, and they don't want to disappoint, and they're very nervous, and that can result in low self-esteem. And this is correlational research here in regards to these personality traits of children in an authoritarian home. The other type of parent would be a permissive parent, where there are very few and inconsistent rules and a very relaxed approach to parenting. Some might say that a permissive parent is uninvolved. Whether it's a choice or not, we don't know. But sometimes uninvolved parents make very few demands, and they show a very low responsiveness, and maybe they fail to communicate with their kids. And by giving them their space, it can sometimes be interpreted as, I don't care about you enough to ask you and want to be involved in the world with you and what's going on with you. So there can be a negative connotation and a negative point of view when it comes to permissive parenting. Although I would guess that there are instances in your life where you wish that your parents were more permissive. Or if you have friends that have permissive parents, why can't you be like so-and-so's parents, they let them do anything. But on the flip side, there are definitely some negatives to permissive parenting. They can be seen as maybe too soft. So in the middle is what we call an authoritative parenting style, and it's much more child-centered. And in an authoritative parenting home, there is some give, authoritative, there is some give and take. They have high expectations. They have rules to follow. There are schedules and there are consequences. But they are also in tune with what is going on in the child's world. And there is a relationship and an interaction between the child and the parent. The result of an authoritative parenting style is that these kids tend to report or tend to show higher self-esteem, self-reliance. They're able to take care of themselves, be more independent, and have a higher degree of social competence. So you can see on this pie chart here, if you look at the arrows and the results of what happens as a result of a certain parenting style, just to review, an authoritative parent is going to have a cooperative child. A permissive parent could quite often have a rebellious child. And an authoritarian parent may end up with a passive child. So these are some of the possible outcomes depending on the parenting style in the home. So now we got to turn and go down kind of a dark, sad, maybe slightly uncomfortable road. And when we think about young kids who are exposed to extended abuse or trauma or neglect, the reality is that they are at a higher risk for psychological disorders, for health problems, for entering a life or instances of crime and possible substance abuse. And so all of these relationships with parents, with caregivers, and that sense of feeling secure, if that is at any way jeopardized as a child, it can have an impact on the child's future. And so circling back to Harry Harlow again, and what he further researched and found out was that these monkeys that were very isolated and they weren't given one of those pretend terry cloth caregiver mother substitutes. These monkeys became isolated, they withdrew, he would observe them rocking back and forth, and very often they would become very aggressive if they were put into a social situation. And so that was the result of the deprivation of that attachment. And there's something called the abuse breeds abuse phenomenon. And what we know is that 9 of 16 females who were in an abusive home and were abused by their mothers, 9 out of 16 females would become abusive parents. And this is a frightening, uncomfortable, scary statistics. And that most abusive parents report being neglected or even battered as children. So it's a cycle, and it's important to be aware and to understand so that this phenomenon can be stopped. So there we go. The arrow indicates we are done with this lecture on attachment. Great job, psychology.